I have told this story only twice. Once to the matriarch, who already knew the truth of it better than I did, and once, near the end of my life, to my granddaughter, who is the kind of child who is allowed to be held. I will tell it a third time now plainly, because I am old, and because the plain telling is the only one that has ever done it justice. I am Usme of the Iridine line, and for a long time I was ashamed of the thing I am about to tell you. I am not ashamed of it anymore. I am only sorry it took a human scrubbing a stone floor to teach me what my own people had forgotten they ever knew. You must understand the turning hall first, or none of the rest will land the way it should. The Iridine measure worth by light. We are a pale folk, and there is a faint glow that lives under our skin, brightest at the throat and the wrists, and the old belief, older than any law, old as the first hatch lines, is that the light is the line itself made visible, the inheritance shining through the body that carries it. A direct heir, one in the true succession, burns clear and steady. The rest of us burn too, but we are spares, surplus blood. The court keeps its surplus the way a wealthy house keeps a cellar full of lamps it will never light, as proof of abundance, as insurance against a dark year, and otherwise out of the way. The out-of-the-way place is the turning hall. It is the most beautiful room I have ever stood in, and I have stood in throne rooms grown from single crystals and in gardens that float. The turning hall is a great bright rotunda, walls of pale gold and worked silver, a ceiling so high the light pools in it like water, and all through the day and most of the night it turns, not the room, but everything in it. The spare heirs are set to procession. They circle the floor in slow bright rings under the great lamps, dressed in the line's colors, instructed in carriage and song and the 40 courtesies, displayed to whatever visiting house has come to count the court's reserves of blood. They are never still. The keeping wisdom held that a spare heir kept turning was a spare heir kept content. That motion filled the hours, that display gave the small ones purpose, that a body in procession had no time to grow strange. They were beautiful, my court's forgotten children, turning and turning under the lamps, and I believed for most of my life that they were happy, because no one had ever taught me to look at the difference between a child who is content and a child who has simply stopped expecting anything else. I gave a child to the turning hall. I will not soften it. When my 9th hatch came and the reckoners found him 9th in a line where 8 already stood ahead, custom did what custom does. He was set turning. By the oldest courtesy of my people, I was forbidden to name him beyond his ordinal, forbidden to hold him, forbidden to make of a spare any claim that might shadow the true line. To name and to keep a spare child is to say this one matters as much as the heir, and that is the one thing a spare may never be allowed to mean. So he was even 9 on the rolls and nothing on my tongue, and I told myself, as my mother had told me of the brother I never spoke to, that this was kindness, that a thing unnamed cannot be grieved, that a child who expects nothing cannot be disappointed. We had legislated love out of ourselves so cleanly that we had forgotten it was ever a thing a body could do. And my 9th hatch son would not turn. That was the trouble that brought the humans, or rather, that brought one human to my notice, which amounts in this story to the same thing. From the first season he was set in the procession, the boy could not be kept content by motion. He fell out of the rings. He stopped on the bright floor and would not be moved, or he wept in a thin, steady way that no draught silenced, or he woke in the night hours screaming a sound that had no word in it, only need. The tutors tried the 40 courtesies and he learned none of them. The keepers tried the settling drafts and he slept badly and woke worse. They tried more light, on the theory that a spare grows strange in shadow, and they tried brighter song and longer procession, and they tried, at last, simply leaving him to cry himself empty on the principle that a need not answered will eventually starve. His light, they told me, for I was permitted reports, the way one is permitted reports of whether his light was guttering, going thin and gray at the throat. A spare whose light fails is a spare the court is quietly relieved to lose, and so no one was cruel to him, you understand. They were only patient in the way you are patient with a lamp running out of oil. They waited for him to go dark, and they kept him turning while they waited, because that is what the hall was for. I went to see him once in those days. I stood at the high gallery where the bloodkin are permitted to look down on the turning without descending into it, and I picked my son out of the bright rings by the gray of his throat, and I watched a keeper take him by the wrist when he stopped on the floor and set him gently going again, the way you might ride a top that has wobbled, and I felt nothing that I would let myself call anything. I told myself he was content. He had stopped expecting. I knew the difference now only because of what came after. That day I did not know it, and I went back up to the light and the line, and I did not come down again for a long time. Now I will tell you about Marin Call, though I did not learn her name for many weeks after she had already saved my son, and I did not learn what she had been doing for longer than that. The humans had come to the Iridian court the way humans came everywhere in those years, at the edges, in the low rooms, in the work no one of standing would do. There had been an arrangement, some treaty of labor I never read, and a quiet tide of them had filled the galleys and the laundries and the maintenance deeps under the bright halls. They were a short-lived folk, plain to our eyes with no light under their skin at all. We thought of them at first as a kind of warm clay, walking and working and going dark forever after only a handful of our seasons. We did not despise them. You cannot despise a thing you do not see, and we did not see them. They came up through the service shafts into the bright rooms, and they went down again, and the rooms stayed clean, and the children stayed fed, and no one of the line ever thought to wonder by whose hands. Marin worked the night galley 3 levels beneath the turning hall. She was, by human reckoning, a woman past the middle of her short life, a little over 40 of their years, which is nothing, which is a single turn of one of our long seasons. She had a broad plain face and hands ruined by water and heat, and she wore the gray of the kitchen staff, and she sent up the spare heirs' suppers on the lift trays and scrubbed the procession floor in the dead of the night towers after the last ring had been led away to its cells. That was the whole of her station. She was not a tutor or a keeper or a physician. She was the woman who cleaned the floor the children turned on, and warmed the food they would not eat, and she was the lowest thing in a building full of forgotten things. I have tried in the years since to find out why she did what she did. I have asked her, and her answer never satisfied the part of me that wanted a reason large enough to match what it changed. She would only shrug those ruined shoulders and say, in her flat, plain way, that a child was crying and no one was going to him, and that you do not need to be anyone in particular to go to a crying child. You only need to be the one who is there. She was the one who was there. Here is what she did, as I came to understand it, pieced together first from the steward's furious reports, and then, later, from standing in the dark gallery and watching it with my own eyes. In the deep of the night towers, when the procession was over and the keepers had withdrawn, and the great lamps were banked to their lowest amber, my son would wake and begin his thin, steady weeping, alone in his cell at the edge of the hall. And on the nights she worked, which was most nights, for the humans worked nearly all of theirs, Marin Call would hear him through the service grates while she scrubbed the floor, and she would stop scrubbing, and she would go to him. She had no right to. Kitchen staff did not enter the air cells. Kitchen staff did not touch the blood of the line. There were a dozen courtesies forbidding every part of it, and she broke them all the first night and every night after without, I think, ever quite knowing they were there to break. She let herself into the cell with the cleaner's key that opened every low door in the hall, and she found a small gray-throated child rigid with a grief he had no word for. And she did the simplest thing a body can do. She picked him up. She would tell me, years later, that he fought her the first time, that he had been left to cry so long and so often that being held was a thing he no longer understood, and he arched and struck at her with his small fists, and she only held on and let him strike and waited, and after a long while the striking stopped, the way a storm stops, all at once and from exhaustion, and he lay against her shaking. And she carried him down through the service shaft to the night galley where it was warm, because the air cells were kept bright and cool, and the galley was the one warm place in the whole cold building. And she sat him on a sack of meal by the banked cooking coals, and she made him a cup of broth. I have held that cup. It is a dented thing of cheap human tin, no bigger than my 2 hands, the kind the galley issued to its workers to drink their own meals from, and she warmed his broth in it over the coals and blew across the top to cool it, and held it to his mouth. And my son, who had refused the food of the line off plates of worked silver, drank. He drank because a warm thing was being held to his mouth by a body that was holding him, and because the broth tasted of the galley and not of the draughts they hid in his food, and because, I believe this now, though I would have laughed at it once, because he could feel through her arms that she was in no hurry for him to be finished. The keepers were always in a hurry. They had a procession to return him to. Marin had only a floor to scrub, and the floor would wait. And while he drank, she did the 2 things that I think, in the end, mattered more than the warmth or the broth. She used his name, not Eva 9, the ordinal off the rolls. She could not have read the rolls, and would not have cared what they said. The first night she simply called him Little One in her own short tongue, but a child needs a name shaped to himself and not to all small things at once, and so by the 2nd or 3rd night she had made him one out of the only part of his designation she had overheard a keeper use. Ev. That was all. Ev, she would say, drink it slow now, Ev, there's plenty. And no one in the history of the turning hall had ever called any of its children a name that meant only him. We named the line. We named the succession. We did not name spares, because to name a thing is to say it is yours to lose. Marin named him on the first warm night she had him, with no idea she was committing the gravest tenderness in the building, and she went on saying Ev over a tin cup of broth as if it were the most ordinary word in any world, which to her it was. And she hummed. I did not know then what humming was. We have song high, formal, lit from within, the procession songs and the line songs and the 40 courtesies set to melody. We did not have the thing she did, which was a low rough tune with no words and no occasion, made by a tired body for no audience, the kind of sound a human makes to herself over work without noticing she is making it. It was, she told me much later, a tune her own mother had hummed scrubbing floors in some cold human place I will never see, a work tune, a nothing tune, passed down through generations of women who cleaned other people's rooms. She hummed it over my son the way she hummed it over the coals and the meal sacks, because it was simply the sound of her being at peace in her work, and a child who has only ever heard the bright, urgent song of the procession heard, for the first time, the sound a person makes when nothing is wrong. He slept, the first night and every night after, warm broth in a tin cup, his own name in a plain tongue, a rough low tune with no words, and the unhurried arms of a woman with nowhere she had to be. And the child the whole luminous court could not settle slept against the lowest worker in the building like a stone going down through still water. She would carry him back up before the lamps came to full, and lay him in his cell and finish her floor, and go down to her own cot in the human levels, and say nothing to anyone, because it had not occurred to her that she had done anything that would need saying. I do not know how many nights this went on before the gray began to leave his throat. Weeks, certainly. The reports I was permitted said only that the 9th hatch spare had grown unaccountably steadier, that he held the procession now without falling out of the rings, that his light had stopped guttering and was, even, the reckoners noted with mild surprise, brightening. They credited a new draft. They credited the patience of the keepers. They credited, I think, anything but the truth, because the truth was 3 levels down scrubbing a floor and had no light at all. It was the steward who found it out. His name was Cauldre, and I want to be fair to him, because it would be easy in the telling to make him the villain, and he was not one. He was the steward of the turning, an old careful Iridine who had run the hall for longer than I had been alive, and he believed in it. He believed the keeping wisdom the way I had believed it, the way you believe the floor will hold you without ever having looked. He was not cruel, he was correct. And one night, doing his rounds, he found a cell empty that should not have been, and he followed the service shaft down toward the warmth. And he came into the night galley and found a human kitchen hand sitting on the floor in the cold light with the ninth hatch air of the Iridine line asleep in her lap and a tin cup cooling beside her, and she was humming. He told me afterward, in the worst trouble of his long life, that the thing that frightened him was not the broken courtesy. It was the boy's face. He had never, he said, seen a spare heir's face do that in sleep. Loosened, trusting, the face of a child who has set a burden down, and it frightened Cauldre because in 40 seasons of keeping the hall he had never once thought a spare heir had a burden to set down at all. But fright in an old careful official does not become tenderness, it becomes rule. He woke her gently, he swore, though I doubt it, and he took the child, and he told her in the cold clear way of his office that she had broken the law of the hall, that kitchen staff did not touch the blood of the line, that she would not enter the cells again, that she would not be near the heirs again, that if she went down a shaft toward a child again, she would be put off the court entirely, and her labor contract void and herself sent back to whatever short, cold human world she had come from. He told her to forget she had ever held him, and then he carried my son back up to his bright, cool cell and laid him in it and left him, and went to revise the locks so the cleaner's key would no longer open the low doors. Marin told me she did not argue. There was nothing to argue. She was the lowest thing in the building, and he was the steward of the turning, and the law was the law. She finished her floor. She went down to her cot. And the next night, and the night after, she scrubbed the procession floor and heard, through the service grates she could no longer pass, a thin, steady weeping start up in the deep of the night towers, and she stood in the empty, bright hall with her brush in her ruined hands, and she did not go to him, because she could not, and because to be put off the court would mean she could never go to him again at all. She made, she said, the worst arithmetic of her life, that staying near and useless was better than being sent away and gone. I have thought about that arithmetic many times. It is the arithmetic of every person who has ever loved from a station that forbids it, and it is a kind of suffering my luminous, long-lived people had arranged never to have to feel, by the simple method of never loving from any station at all. And my son came undone. It was fast this time. The gray came back into his throat within days, deeper than before, because a child who has been held and then is not held again does not return to the old emptiness. He falls past it. He stopped holding the procession. He fell out of the rings and lay on the bright floor and would not rise, and the keepers, who had grown used to the steadier boy, took him up by the wrists and set him going, and he fell again, and they tried the draughts and he slept and woke screaming, and this time the scream had a shape. The keepers reported it as agitation. Cauldre, who knew exactly what it was and could not say so without confessing what he had forbidden, reported it as a relapse. But a keeper who had a kind streak and a closer ear wrote it down honestly in the night log, and that honest line is how the whole of it finally climbed up out of the deeps and into the light where I was, because the line read simply, "The ninth hatch spare cries a sound that resembles a name. It cries Mar. Mar." As much of Marin as a small, grieving alien throat could shape. He was calling for her. He had been given, for a few warm weeks, the one thing my people had decided no spare may have a person who was his, and it had been taken back, and he was calling its name into a bright, cold room where no one knew the name belonged to anything, crying Mar, Mar, Mar until his voice went, and then crying it without a voice, and the keepers wrote agitation and increased the light. The star matriarch Alun read the night log. She read every night log. It was one of the unglamorous habits that had kept her on the high seat for 9 reigns of lesser houses. And she did the thing that changed everything, which was not a grand thing, only the thing none of the rest of us had done. She asked what Mar was. No one could tell her. The keepers did not know. The tutors did not know. Cauldre knew and went the color old Iridine go when their light drops in fear, and he confessed it, the human, the broken courtesy, the warm cup, the weeks of stolen nights, the boy who had brightened and now was going dark crying half of a kitchen hand's name. He confessed it expecting to be ended, because by every law of the hall he had been right to forbid it, and the boy's collapse was therefore the human's fault and not the law's, and he could not understand why the matriarch did not seem to be hearing it that way at all. Alun was very old, even for us. She had outlived her own true line and seen the seat pass sideways twice, and she had, I think, lived long enough to have run out of the comfortable certainties the rest of us were still padding our lives with, the way a very old person sometimes circles all the way back round to the simplest seeing. She heard the steward out, and then she said, Cauldre repeated it to me so many times I have it word for word, she said, "You are telling me a child of my blood was dying, and a stranger of no blood at all stopped it with a cup of broth, and your response was to take the broth away. Bring me the human, and bring me the child's mother." That was how I came to be summoned to the turning hall in the dead of the night hours, I who had not descended to its floor in years, summoned not as a princess of the line, but as a thing I had spent my whole life being permitted to forget I was. The mother of the child. They had not used that word about me since the hatching. I did not at first understand that it was me she meant. I will tell the last of it slowly, because it is the part I have come, in my long life, to think of as the only part of my life that was entirely true. The hall was banked low when I came down, the great lamps at their dimmest amber, and it was the first time I had ever seen it still. No procession, no turning, just the vast pale floor and the high pool dark in the ceiling, and in the center of it, 3 figures and a fourth. The matriarch Alun on a plain chair they had carried out for her, wrapped against the cold of the place. Cauldre standing apart with his light low. And on the floor, on the cold, bright procession floor, where 1,000 spare children had turned and turned, my son, rigid, gray to the throat, past screaming now, making the small, dry, broken sound of a child who has cried out everything he has. No one was touching him. The keepers stood back. They did not know how. We had unlearned how so thoroughly that a room full of his own kind stood helpless around a dying child, because not one of us knew the shape your arms are supposed to make. And then they brought in the human. I had never been close to one. She came across that vast floor in the gray of the kitchen staff, water-ruined hands, plain face, no light in her at all, the lowest thing in the building, walking into the center of the highest room in the court because the star matriarch of the Iridine line had sent for her. And she was, I remember this clearly, she was not afraid. Not in the way I expected. She came in like a woman called to a job. Her eyes went past the matriarch and past me and past all the rank in the room and found the small gray shape on the floor, and her whole plain face changed, and she said one word in her flat tongue, not to any of us, to him. Ev. And my son, who had not responded to the keepers or the drafts or the light or his own dying, turned his head toward the sound of his name in that one plain voice, and made the broken sound again and reached. She did not ask the matriarch's leave. She did not glance at me. She crossed the last of the floor and went down onto her ruined knees on the cold stone and gathered him up, all of him, gray throat against her gray collar, and he fought her exactly as she had told me he fought her the first night, arched and struck and could not understand being held after being unheld. And she did exactly what she had done the first night. She held on. She let him strike. She waited. And into that vast, still bright room where my whole shining civilization stood helpless and watching, a human kitchen hand began, low and rough and tuneless, to hum. The work tune, the nothing tune, the sound a tired woman makes scrubbing a floor when nothing is wrong. I watched the striking stop. I watched it stop the way she had told me it would, all at once, the storm running out, and I watched my son go from rigid to shaking to still against the body of a woman who was not permitted to touch him, and I watched the gray begin, I swear it on my long life, begin to go out of his throat, a thread of true light climbing back up into it, while she hummed and rocked very slightly on her knees and held the back of his head in one ruined hand, and I, the mother of the line, who had given him to this floor and been forbidden to grieve it, stood at the edge with the rank and the keepers and understood at last, far too late, The difference between a child who is content and a child who has only stopped expecting anything else. He slept, right there on the cold floor in the lowest arms in the court. The forgotten heir slept the deep sleep he had slept 3 levels down over a tin cup, and the whole hall was so silent I could hear the human breathing. And then, half asleep, surfacing for a moment the way the very young do, my son put his small hand flat against that plain gray collar, against the place where her light would have been if she had had any, and he said, in her tongue, the only tongue that had ever been kind to him, the word she had taught him without knowing she was teaching it, the human word for the thing she had been to him that we had no honest word for at all. He said, "Mother," and he slept again. I want to tell you what that word did in that room, but I do not have the gift for it. I can tell you that the matriarch Alun, who had outlived her own line and seen the seat pass twice, and was past being moved by anything the court did, made a sound I had never heard an Iridine of the high seat make. I can tell you that Caldra, the steward who had been right by every law in the building, put his low light in his hands and wept for the rightness of it. I can tell you that I, Usme of the Iridine line, the boy's own mother by hatch and blood and the oldest courtesy of my people, stood and heard another woman called the word that should have been mine, and felt no jealousy at all, only the clean, terrible grief of a person seeing, all at once, the entire shape of what she has missed. I had been forbidden to give him that word. She had been forbidden too, and had given it anyway, because she had never agreed to the forbidding, because she was a short-lived woman with ruined hands who believed, simply, that you go to a crying child, and that you do not need to be anyone in particular to do it. You only need to be the one who is there. The matriarch did not make a prize of her. I have told this story to enough of the line over the years to know that is the part they expect, that the human was raised up, made noble, married into the blood, given a title and a light she did not have. They expect it because it is the only shape our imaginations have for reward, elevation into us. Alun was wiser and stranger and kinder than that. She knew you cannot reward a thing like what Marin did by turning Marin into the kind of creature that could never have done it. She did 3 things instead, there in the dim hall before the light came up, and I have honored all 3 to the end of my reign. She gave Marin the child, not as a servant given charge of a ward, as a keeping in the full and final sense, the sense my people had reserved for the true line and denied to every spare for longer than our records run. He has named you, the matriarch said. I will not unname you. The child is yours to keep, and the courts to provide for, and no courtesy of this hall stands above the word he said. She broke the turning. Not all at once, an old institution does not die in a night. And there were seasons of argument I will not bore you with, but she ruled that night that no spare of the Iridine line would again be kept by motion and display, that every forgotten child of the court would have a keeping of their own, a person who was theirs, a name shaped to themselves and no one else, and that the keeping wisdom of 1,000 turning years was a lie we had told ourselves to excuse the one thing we were too proud and too long-lived to do, which was to love a child we might lose. The humans, as it happened, were good at loving things they would lose. They had never had any other kind of thing to love. We had a great deal to learn from the warm, short-lived clay we had not been seeing, and under Alun we began, slowly, shamefully, gratefully, to learn it. And the third thing she did was the smallest, and it is the one I think of most. She asked Marin her name, the full one, not the human and not the kitchen hand and not even Marin as the keepers had begun, embarrassed to call her, but her whole name, the way you ask the name of a person who matters. And she said it back to make sure she had it, Marin call, and inclined the high seat of the Iridine line very slightly to a woman who cleaned floors. We had never named the humans either, you see. It was all of a piece. A folk that will not name its own spare children will not trouble to name the hands that feed them. The matriarch named her, in front of the whole hall, and it was the second great tenderness committed in that building. And like the first one, it was committed by acknowledging that a small, overlooked thing had a self worth speaking to. Marin took it all the way she took everything. Plainly. She did not weep and she did not kneel and she did not understand, I think, for a long time, the size of what had happened, because to her nothing very large had happened at all. A child she had been kept from had been given back to her, and that was good, and she was tired and the floor was still dirty. When the matriarch finished, Marin shifted the sleeping boy higher on her shoulder and looked around the great still bright hall full of the rank of the court, and asked, I remember the exact flat words because they were so entirely hers, she asked whether someone could see about the warm. The cells were kept too cold for a child, she said. He never slept right up here. It was warmer down in the galley. Could the cells not be made warmer? The star matriarch of the Iridine line, who had just remade 1,000 years of keeping law, said yes. Yes, the cells would be made warmer. And I watched the most powerful person in my world take instruction on the raising of a child from a kitchen hand with ruined hands, and write it down. And I understood that the whole shining structure of my people had just been quietly turned on its head by a woman whose only weapon had ever been that she was willing to be the one who was there. She kept him. I want to be honest about my own part to the end. She kept him and I did not. I could have fought it. The blood was mine and the oldest courtesies, even broken, still bent my way if I had pressed them. I did not press them. I had stood at that high gallery for years and called my son content while he guttered, and I had felt nothing I would let myself name, and I knew, watching him sleep on a stranger's shoulder with his light coming back, that I had forfeited the word he gave her by every season I had spent earning the right not to. The truest thing I ever did as his mother was to let his mother keep him. But I did not vanish from it, and that is the mercy I was given that I did not deserve. Marin Call, who owed me nothing, who could have shut the line out of the child it had thrown away, did the opposite. She let me in, slowly, plainly, on her own terms and on the boys'. She let me come down to the galley, for she would not leave it. The matriarch offered her bright high rooms, and she said the boy slept better near the coals, and so the air of a tenderness that remade a civilization was raised in a kitchen by his own insistence. She let me come down and sit on a meal sack and learn, from a human, in my own halls, how to hold my own son. She taught me to warm the broth and blow across it. She taught me the rough nothing tune, though I never had the voice for it. She taught me to be in no hurry. She taught me, an immortal of the shining line, the one thing my immortal shining line had legislated away, and she taught it the way she did everything, without ceremony, as a job that needed doing, while the boy we shared grew bright and loud and strange and wonderful between us. He is grown now. He carries no rank. There was none to give a spare, and the new keeping law did not invent titles, only love, which the matriarch judged correctly to be the rarer inheritance. He keeps children of his own now, forgotten ones, the way he was kept. The turning hall is a warm place these days, full of names and tin cups and rough tuneless humming, and he runs it. And when visiting houses come to count the court's reserves of blood, he shows them instead a room full of children being held, and most of them do not understand what they are looking at, and a few of them go very quiet, and those few are the ones I have hope for. Marin is gone. She was short-lived, as I told you at the start, warm clay, a single turn of one of our long seasons, and I outlived her by a span she could not have imagined, and I sat with her at the end the way she had sat with him at the beginning, in the warm, in no hurry, humming the tune badly. She did not think she had done anything large. She told me so near the end, when I tried to thank her for the whole of it, for the child and the broken law and the remade court, and the thing she had taught a whole shining people about themselves. She shook her ruined head at me, and she said the thing I have carried since, the thing that is the truest verdict ever passed on my luminous, long-lived, forgetful folk, and on the warm, short people we had not been seeing. She said, a child was crying, me, and nobody was going to him. And then she shrugged, the way she always did, as if that settled it, as if it were the most ordinary fact in any world. Nobody was going to him. We had a court of immortals and a hall of gold and a keeping wisdom 1,000 turning years deep, and a child was crying, and nobody was going to him. until the lowest pair of hands in the building set down a scrub brush and went. That is the whole of it. That is what a human did that all our light could not. She was the one who was there. I have told it plainly now, the third and last time, and I find I am not ashamed of it any more. I am only still, all these long years on, learning the tune.